I am the Reverend Ann Dieterle, the rector at Calvary Episcopal Church in Columbia, Missouri, and this is the week 3 summary of Brene Brown's book, Atlas of the Heart, that we're using for our OneRead. We are covering chapters 6, 7, and 8 this week, some of the more dense material that we've encountered so far in this read. And I want to preface all that by saying that I'm going to put in the comments both on YouTube and on Facebook when I post the video 3 separate links that in case you don't have the book, or even if you have the book and want to take a look at some material more in more detail, that you can do that, and that will help summarize this material by my giving you more homework. So if you choose to engage it, one is a link to or a description of a painting that she references in chapter 6, Places We Go When We're Hurting, on the emotion of anguish. The second is going to be a video, a YouTube video on the difference between empathy and sympathy, which is well worth your time. It's a cute little cartoon that somebody drew based on a talk she gave. And then the third thing I'm going to reference is, and she references it in here as well, is Kristen Neff's inventory about self-compassion. And I've taken that a number of times. I can tell you that you'll find links in Kristen Neff's work to practices you can do to increase your self-compassion. And I offer that to you because I have seen that change for myself over the course of the few years since I've discovered it. So, places we go when we're hurting, and those emotions include, this is in chapter 6, anguish, hopelessness, despair, sadness, and grief. We were joking kind of to dispel some grief or avoid some of the heaviness of it in one of our conversations, that sadness is the good one of all of these, the less heavy. I mentioned the anguish painting. It's a lamb, a mother sheep over her baby who has died, and just how that takes your breath away and that you feel it in your bones, and that how that covers really the depth of that particular emotion. That one was really the hardest for me to look at, because I think partly because it really speaks to what it is and has that evocative reaction for me, and also because we refer to Jesus as the Lamb of God. I think I identified or linked that to Mary, the Mother of God, and also Mary Magdalene, who were 2 of the women present at Jesus's death, and who probably experienced that. We think of Mary in the garden in John's Gospel after Jesus's death and before the resurrection, as experiencing that type of anguish. She also lists a bunch of sad movies in this particular chapter, and how it's that sadness is a companion or maybe a precursor to joy and to pleasure. I don't know about you, but I do enjoy watching sad movies, sometimes because it is a way to process some of my own sadness, or just because it seems to connect me to other emotions that I'm experiencing that go along with sadness side by side. In addition to sad movies, I've been joking that you can also listen to sad songs, basically anything by Adele, for instance, who is one of my favorite musicians. But you can check out that particular list of movies on page 104 in her book. I don't know if that relates to, or if that resonates with you, the experience of watching sad movies in order to connect with something deep in yourself. There's also, in what our discussions, Brene Brown doesn't particularly care for stages of grief, because grief is non-linear and most people don't go through it in that way. And so we had some discussion about that in our groups this week. I liked her contribution to, and I actually really like Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's stages. I never took them as having to be linear, but her descriptions of anger, denial, acceptance, depression, and bargaining, I have found helpful. I also find Brene Brown's talk about grief to be helpful as well. On page 113, she references the work of the Center for Complicated Grief and talks about grief as acute grief, the initial period after a loss, integrated grief, the result of adaptation to loss, complicated grief, when something interferes with adaptation, and then finally disenfranchised grief. One of the key things she says about grief is that it wants to be witnessed. And in disenfranchised grief, that is a grief that is generally not acknowledged by public ritual, and that can be a real barrier. So things like divorce, which are not acknowledged by public ritual, or if you're a survivor of some kind of assault or have lost a loved one to death by suicide, that those things can be very difficult to get through because grief wants to be witnessed, and these are things that are not witnessed in a public way. So I offer that to you from chapter 6 for further exploration, and to think about it and invite ourselves to think about how are we present to ourselves in those moments, and how are we present to others? Because being able to be present to someone who is grieving can help them experience that ritual of a grief being witnessed. And then especially in disenfranchised grief, how important that is and how difficult it is. Moving on to places we go with others, which is in chapter 7, she talks about compassion, pity, empathy, sympathy, boundaries, and comparative suffering. I've said already, I'm going to link the video to the difference between empathy and sympathy. So I'm not going to talk about that at this point. If you want to look at it, you can go further. But to talk about compassion, particularly being a daily experience, our daily practice of recognizing and accepting our shared humanity so that we treat ourselves and others with loving kindness, and we take action in the face of suffering. So compassion is not just a cognitive exercise, but it is something that moves us to actually act on behalf of the person who is suffering, whether that be us or someone else. And that doesn't necessarily mean that we fix or resolve it, but it does mean that we form connection, and that's where empathy comes in. I also want to talk a little bit about boundaries here, because in and of itself, boundaries is something that we need boundaries in order to know where I end and you begin, or where you end and I begin. And without that, Brown says, we cannot have compassion, we cannot have empathy, because we end up getting enmeshed with somebody else and with that experience, or we over-identify with an experience. And so being able to say what behavior is acceptable to us and how people treat us, and to be able to say no to ourselves and to others, is an important component to that. And so if you don't have boundaries, meaning if you're not able to say no, if you're not able to say, this is where I end and you begin, that may be a first step of working on, a first thing to work on, so that you're able then to practice compassion and empathy. She also talks about some empathy misses, which we all do. This is not to make us feel bad about it. Sympathy versus empathy is one. Judgment is another. You should feel shame for doing what you did. And then advice giving and problem solving. I think that is one of the things that one of the behaviors we go to, because we're trying to fix it, because we're trying to ease our own discomfort. As a pastor, as a minister, that is a particularly hard thing, a trap to not fall into. If we think we see a path through somebody's problem, it can be hard not to offer that, even when that is not called for. And it can also be hard because sometimes somebody wants you to fix that for them. And a friend of mine, a wise friend, said, don't do for somebody else what they can and should do for themselves. An insight there that touches boundaries and empathy and compassion that I'll leave you with. Comparative suffering is another practice and emotion that may get us into trouble, and has been maybe more prevalent during COVID times. How can my suffering be real if your suffering is so much worse? That kind of thing. Our experience doesn't change, our emotions don't necessarily change because of what somebody else is going through. It's not that perspective taking isn't important, but it doesn't mean that your suffering is any less real, or your pain or your emotions are any less real. And finally, places we go when we fall short. Chapter 8, shame, self-compassion, perfectionism, guilt, humiliation, and embarrassment. And again, I referenced the self-compassion inventory that I'll put in the comments and in the chat feature. Well, not the chat, the comments feature, both in Facebook and in YouTube. And so I won't say too much else about that. But I do want to, one of the things that was insightful for me when I first learned it was the difference between shame and guilt. Shame, I am bad, versus guilt, I did something bad. And how those guilt can be motivating and shame is demoralizing. So if you catch yourself thinking, I'm bad because I did something, just know that that's probably not going to inspire you to move forward. So it's something that is worth sharing with someone you trust, because one thing that shame cannot stand is it being spoken. Shame thrives in silence. And one of her first works, Brene Brown's, was a book called I Thought It Was Just Me. And that being that shame is something that exists when you think that it's only you who's going through something, when actually it's not. So again, noticing where shame shows up in your life is an important first step for finding someone who you can talk about that with, because it's ultimately going to hamper you and keep you feeling down. And then perfectionism, which she distinguishes between a healthy striving for excellence. Perfectionism is actually where shame is the birthplace of shame, because we can never actually be perfect. There's always something that you can do to make it better. And if you wait for yourself to be perfect, or you wait for your product to be perfect before putting it out into the world, that will actually never happen. And so it actually keeps you from that healthy striving, and it contributes to feeling shame, because it's as if you have fallen short because you can't be perfect, when perfection is not a reasonable goal and expectation in the first place. So I will stop there and end with just saying that I hope that this is helping you to have some compassion for yourself and for others as you experience your own emotions. And to say that one of the things that has occurred to me is there are links between some of these emotions, talking about it, and prayer practices that we can do. I'll link one here, in that one of the important components for self-compassion is mindfulness. And mindfulness is an antidote to over-identification. So if I am angry and I over-identify with that anger, that means I'm giving it more energy than it really needs. Now, anger can be a great motivator. I've found that in my own life. That usually means there's something I need to do. But if we over-identify with that, we get carried away with it. And then anger ends up having us rather than us feeling anger. And that reminds me of centering prayer, where we notice our emotions, we observe them, we note whether or not it's something we need to do, or if there's something we need to do about it. But ultimately, we don't pursue or resist those emotions. And so in so doing, we're able to hold it mindfully and not get taken up by it in one direction or the other. All right. Well, if you've gotten this far, thanks for watching. Again, I will put those links to some further exploration in the chat. And I hope that you have a wonderful day and a wonderful week. God bless you. Bye-bye.